Before we start today's show, I wanted to tell you a little bit about Anchor, which is what we are using to distribute the show's Reversing Climate Change and Carbon Removal Newsroom here at Nori. If you're looking to start your own podcast or you already have a podcast, Anchor is free. They make money off of placing ads in your show at your discretion. They take a cut of that. That's how they make money. So you're no longer paying for distribution fees. It's easy. It has a whole bunch of tools. I expect probably more tools will be coming in the future. I find it to be a very easy way to fit into my podcasting workflow, one might say. So download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. And thanks so much for listening.
You're listening to the Reversing Climate Change podcast by the team at Nori, the carbon removal marketplace. This is a show about the innovators and entrepreneurs developing solutions to climate change. Hi, everyone. This is Alexandra Guerra from Nori, co-founder and director of corporate development. For this bonus episode, we've invited Nicole Sistrom, founder of Sutro Energy Group. Nicole has written an article about the 3 ways CEOs can tackle climate change and build a net zero economy. So we thought we'd have a fun little conversation, record it, and share it with you guys so that maybe you can inform your business leaders on how we can achieve net zero economies through changing our business practices. Hi, Nicole. Thanks for being here.
How are you doing? It's great to be here.
Yeah, we're great. So you wrote this 3 ways CEOs can tackle climate change. It's on the World Economic Forum. We'll include a link into the show notes. But why don't you tell us, what are those 3 ways that we can tackle climate change?
Sure. So I guess I'd start by saying, I know your whole company is based around this, like, climate is a problem. There's a role for really everyone to play. And I think it's been really heartening to see the corporate world start to really step up, at least in words, over the past 12 months, I'd say. And now, the science is pointing us towards, this is really the decade where we have to cut 50% of emissions in order to stay on track to hit our 2050 goals. And the corporate world really needs to start turning those words into action. So that was really the motivation for writing this piece. And so I outlined 3 ways that CEOs can really work on this. And the first one is supporting early stage entrepreneurs in climate and climate technology and helping to scale solutions. The second is lending climate innovators political capital. So helping early stage companies really play in the political arena where, large corporations have a lot more infrastructure and experience. And then finally, making net zero a part of your business strategy. So happy to dig into any of those that are interesting.
Well, I thought it was really interesting that you had laid out 1 and 2. So it's not just supporting early stage startups financially. It's also about supporting them politically. I think that rings really true for us because we see, particularly within the space of carbon removal, that's one part of the climate change space, that it's very nascent. And there's a lot that's constantly changing and shifting. So now there's the Biden administration, and they're talking about a carbon bank. And, we've been here 3 years trying to create a voluntary marketplace for carbon removal with farmers. And so, everything is constantly changing, and we always want to be involved in those conversations. But that seems like something almost, when I read that, limited to businesses that are a little bit larger. So maybe corporations that have some political pool or capital, as opposed to smaller organizations where maybe they can't even help out in that way. Yeah.
Well, so I guess what I'm getting at here is, from a climate tech innovation perspective, many of these companies they're small, right? And a lot of them are still working out there's a lot of work to do just to get the technology developed or the business innovation, the financial innovation, whatever the innovation of the company is. It's still, these climate technology companies are still early in their life cycle. And there's just a lot of hustle just to do the work of the company itself. But it's still important to remember that all of these startups are happening within a within a policy context, within a political context. I think, maybe 15 years ago, in the kind of first round of what we call the green tech, then there was a lot of emphasis on the startup as related to policy changes and how policy would affect the startup. And a lot of business plans, a lot of companies got funded based on, a carbon tax getting passed, like a future carbon tax being passed. And then those things didn't happen. And I think investors and, entrepreneurs really got burned in their connection to policy. But I'm hopeful that we're sort of like the circle is kind of coming back around, right? Because we can't make the changes we need to make as a global society, as a global economy, without changing our laws and changing our policies. And I think a lot of startups are realizing, once again, your work with carbon removal is probably the best example of like how important policy is in order to get these companies, these early stage climate technologies kind of kickstarted in the way that we need them to be. At the same time, most of the entrepreneurs at the early stages that I've met they don't get into this because they know about policy. They get into it because they are passionate about climate in general, or they're passionate about whatever technology they have. They're technologists often at the very beginning. And they don't frankly have time to go figure out like who to talk to in Washington, DC, let alone any one of the state governments, if we're speaking from a US perspective, which I know this analogy extends to other countries around the world. And a lot of larger companies they're large enough to have, sort of whole regulatory departments and policy people on staff, and they lobby all the time. They lobby, they're very happy to lobby on things that aren't necessarily directly in line with their business, their business model. But it just seems to me like there's an opportunity here. I mean, at a minimum, what we need is the corporate world to stop lobbying against climate action, because there's a lot of that going on, unfortunately. Companies stand in the way and say, oh, we can't do anything on climate because that will hurt us in some way, which it provides a lot of cover for policymakers to then not take the bold action we need to take. So I think at a minimum, we need to ask this kind of large corporate lobbyists to stop lobbying against climate action. But then furthermore, I think figuring out a way to lift up climate technologists and help them engage in the policy arena in an effective way, I think can really help move the policy environment forward in a way that actually helps the climate tech get something done, right? Because the other thing that I think can happen is those policymakers that are working on innovation policy, which is I think a lot of what you and I are talking about at this moment, like if innovators aren't part of that conversation, there's no guarantee that policy gets made in a way that actually helps the innovator.
That's exactly what I was going to say. It's really interesting because we're all playing a very essential role. Yeah. And we're all part of a crew, really, on this one deck. So policymakers, innovators, large established companies and corporations, and we have to be communicating with each other. And the unique role that early innovators or startups in the climate tech space or any space can play is that they can innovate and test, because we have lower risk, we have lower capital, we don't really have like a set, very functioning, highly operating, high volume business model. We can test and iterate and build new solutions. That's something that policymakers can't do. And so, yeah, it needs to be an open dialogue where learnings can be shared between the two, and what the innovators learn or share can be implemented or at least considered in the policy that's being made. I think that's my one concern, is when policies get over prescriptive. It's like, wait, you would take forever to innovate and fix the mistake of the assumption that you made in the policy that you wrote. So.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like, it's so right. I mean, making good policy, that's why we have professional policymakers, like, because it is a hard thing to do. But, it's like, I think about the 45Q tax credit, right? Which is so many people point to as like, this is the policy we have to support carbon removal. But like, if you're not a huge company, like if you don't have a huge project that's removing massive amounts of carbon, you can't take advantage of it, which stifles this whole carbon removal, nascent industry. We have so much innovation going on. It's questions like that where, like, if innovators were at the table and they could say, we have to lower this limit, or how can we make this work so that it's more available to everyone, then I think, we lift all the boats at once, versus just like Chevron being the only company that's able to like take advantage of it, which I don't think is desirable for us to get where we're going.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I want to shift a little bit to your point number 3, which is make net zero part of your business strategy.
Yeah.
Every business is different in its shape, size, customers, market, what they're doing. Can you tell us a little bit of some of the examples that you have seen to work to make net zero part of how you run your business?
Yeah. I think, well, maybe another way to state this, make net zero part of your business strategy, is my belief that, like, if you are a company, you are a climate company. Like, everyone needs to be asking, if you are operating and doing business right now, you need to be asking yourself the question of, like, how does a changing climate affect what we do, and what can we do to be resilient to a changing climate and hopefully help mitigate against that climate. So I think maybe one of the most public examples of this is Microsoft, right? Like, they do software. It's not like a company that you're like, oh, there's I guess their software, running software consumes electricity, and like they should be concerned about, energy efficiency in that way. Like, fine. But, I think Microsoft for many decades now has been experimenting with different ways to bring climate into its work and innovate against it. I mean, for a while, they had an internal carbon tax that they sort of imposed on every business decision, which I think is pretty wild and innovative. And now, now they have a climate fund. They just have a lot of people working on how climate should come into their decisions, but also into their customers' decisions, right? And I think it's all from the perspective of, we have a better, more sustainable world, then there's a better economy that helps Microsoft grow its earnings, right? So I think every company can be asking itself, what climate risk do I have, and what opportunity do I have to affect that, and or benefit from adopting some kind of climate innovation. I think just the very basic questions of, like, where are you sited? How would a disaster affect your operations? Like, what can you do to be resilient to that? Where do your people live? Are they safe? Starting from that basic perspective makes a lot of sense to me. And I also think, there's the kind of normal list of, like, try to switch to renewable energy and do, become more efficient in your operation, which people should definitely do. But I think it's more what the climate question really invites you to do is take a broader long-term view on where your business is headed and the impact it's having beyond maybe just what you sell every day.
I see the value in what you're saying, right? Like, hey, one of the co-founders of a climate change startup, so I'm not going to disagree with what you're stating here. I am going to push back a little where it's like, I don't know that every company or business should see themselves as a climate business. I think they should. It's kind of like, it's interesting because we're seeing a shift, right? So before it was, if I'm going to make a business, it's to make money because that's the point, or to have fulfilling work, etc. I think we're seeing a shift now, especially in the millennials, where it's not just about the money or the salary. It's, do I feel like I belong? Do I feel like there's purpose in my work? What is the impact, etc.? And we're seeing a shift in that way, which is good. So we could see a shift where more businesses make net zero part of their business strategy. But there are still, so I've been living in Peru for about 6 months. And there's a lot of industry, of course, from there, because you have businesses who are taking commodities and selling them to other foreign-owned organizations that then might sell them in the US or Europe or something, right? And I wonder, for those types where you have just communities that are just trying to survive, like, and we have a lot of that also in the US as well. Like, we have businesses that are just like, they're trying to maintain their community. How do we speak to them in a way where it's like, look, it's not a either or? Like, how do we tie in climate when it's so separate from what the business owners are even thinking, or the community is concerned about?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a good, I like the question. It's a good pushback. I guess what I would argue is that I'm encouraging people to at least ask the question, right? To at least have it on their radar that this is a thing. I think if you're a Fortune 500 company, like, you should be having a lot of activity on this, hands down, no questions asked, right? I think what you're pointing to are these sort of smaller entities and maybe in emerging economies where people are still kind of scrambling, right? To kind of make the business successful, which I for that group of people, it may be enough to just have the conversation in your mind, to start having the conversation. And I would also tie it back to political power, because I think one of the main reasons that policies on climate don't get passed is because of a storyline about how it's going to ruin an economy, how, switching to renewables will be more expensive, or regenerative agricultural practices will be more expensive and less people will have jobs and therefore, that it's not. And then there's also the whole trope of the problem with the developed world turning to the developing world, right? And saying to emerging economies, like, don't develop those fossil fuel resources you've got. You're trying to lift your country out of raise the standard of living in your country. But please leave all those resources in the ground that you have. Yes, totally agree. That's completely problematic. But what I would argue again is people need to be asking the question and engaging in ways that they can, in ways that make sense to them. I mean, it's not going to make sense for everyone to go all the way. And if you're a small business, you don't need to hire a person to come up with a climate strategy for what you're doing. But I think there's some having the conversation, asking the question, the more that we have this in our mind, in order for us to make the changes we need to make, this is like a top to bottom reorganization of our economy. We have to decarbonize every last little corner of everything. And that is going to touch every business eventually. Maybe not tomorrow, but it will.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And it's a good response, which is, all right, just ask the question. And maybe, and I love that response mainly because it allows room for it to be non-confrontational or to not be something that is threatening, right? Yeah. It's always strange when you ask these types of questions because it might seem like, okay, well, I have to be one or the other. I have to either give it all or give none. And I don't think that the world is so black and white. And we should at least give room for the idea and the exploration of what would happen if I were to consider this thing, because I do care about it or I do believe it's important in some way. And you are totally free not to take action on that. But at least it gave some space, and the more space we allow for these types of conversations on how do we include climate in the decisions that we make every day, business or otherwise, we will continue to, as a society, progress. But then there's always a question of time and urgency. So,
well, so I think one of the other sort of aspects of this conversation is the focus on an individual company and choices at that company level versus trying to change the whole system, right? And maybe that's part of what you're pointing to here is a smaller company, it works within a system, right? It can't completely change how power is delivered, or whether the trucks a company uses are gas powered or, electric, right? But I definitely don't want to make the argument here that if corporations just change their mind, about how to do something, and we're all in on climate, this problem would be fixed. That's not what I'm talking about. I think it's why I'm linking it to political power as well, because that is actually how a system gets changed, is you have to have policy, but these two kind of things have to happen in tandem, right? We need movement in the corporate sector in whatever way it makes sense for the company that, you're a part of and running. And some companies are larger, have larger footprints, have more power. They should be doing more. Versus a smaller company that, is much more at the whim of the system around it. But the more movement we generate within the corporate sector, I think the easier it becomes for policies to move on the kind of timeline that we're talking about. We need to have them move on.
Yeah, again, I think it goes back to the fact that there are key roles that we all play in this effort. The private sector, so corporations, businesses, small, medium size as well, innovators and entrepreneurs and startups, and then policymakers themselves and the people who support them, so voters as well as consumers, we're all part of this. And so having the space or the forum to ask those questions and have those conversations is the key here. And then, and making those connections, making space for them. So that again goes to your point number 2. I didn't even go into point number 1. To me, I kind of just skipped over it because it's kind of like, give money to startups. So let's just do a quick let's just give some space to your point number 1, which is supporting early stage startups.
My point here is that, especially if you're an established company, like you're typically not set up to have major game-changing innovation. You're a large company with a lot of business lines and that business is to protect. And so the innovation that you will do you are most likely to do within your corporate culture already is more incremental, right? Like a better widget, a better dishwasher next time around, a little more efficient lawnmower, that kind of thing. Versus, what the studies show us is that blue sky innovation, at least nowadays, really tends to come from outside of large established businesses. And so what I'm calling for here is the kinds of innovations that we will need. For those kinds of innovations that we still need to address the climate crisis, I'm encouraging those corporations with balance sheets or with philanthropy to think about how to invest in and lift up and support and partner with these early stage companies in ways that help, move their products forward, move their development, and help them scale, so that their products become the climate tech companies, their products become more widely available, and therefore we can have the impact that we hope they'll all have. and then the other point is the innovation piece is forward looking, right? But there are also solutions that already exist, and encourage companies to think about how to help deploy those that are ready to go already. Because again, we're talking about decarbonizing every single corner of our economy, every single corner of our industry. Like it's a big task. It's a really big task.
Yeah. So take some coordination.
Yeah. Yeah.
Great. Well, I really appreciate you sharing some of your insights. We'll include a link to the article that Nicole wrote. Thank you so much for your time here, Nicole.
Oh, it was my pleasure. So fun to chat.
Take care.
You too.
Well, thank you so much for listening. If you like the show, please rate and review it in Apple Podcasts and/or Stitcher. It really helps us a lot to get this content to a wider audience. If you think what we're doing is useful, interesting, fun, hopefully all 3, we'd certainly appreciate your rating and review. You can keep up with Nori at nori.com, where there is a newsletter. That's nori.com/subscribe. There's podcasts. There's a whole bunch else. Or you can send us an email at podcast@nori.com. We are also now on Patreon at patreon.com/noripodcasts if you'd like more content, engagement, and community. And thank you so much for your support.